One of the things I really love with DevRel is being able to just play around with new technologies, explore, push the boundaries of platform, and then engage with the community out there, different partners or customers and so on, and just help them build awesome stuff that solves problems.
Welcome to the Google Workspace Developer Spotlight. Today in the Spotlight is Steve Bazyl. Steve, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Steve, why don't you go ahead and tell us what your role is? I know a lot of people watching this video know you, but for those who might not have had the pleasure of meeting you, what is your role?
I've been around for a while at Google, probably about 15 years now. And currently I manage the Workspace Developer Relations team. It's actually a relatively new role for me, about just a few months now. But I've been in developer relations for about 15 years, most of that time on Workspace.
Very cool. So tell me a little bit about what you particularly like about your job.
I'm going to give two different answers for that one. Partly because of the role change into being a manager, but as a individual contributor, just as an advocate and engineer and so on. One of the things I really love with DevRel is being able to just play around with new technologies, explore, push the boundaries of platform, and then engage with the community out there, different partners or customers and so on, and just help them build awesome stuff that solves problems. As a manager, this is, again, a kind of a new role for me, and, I still have a lot to figure out, getting settled in and learning some things. But, I really love seeing both individuals and the team sort of grow and just do amazing work. Of course, you're one of those people I get to see flourish and do really cool, amazing things. What they both have in common is it's really a team sport. It's not about the stuff I'm building or the stuff I'm doing. It's really about enabling others to build and solve problems that are important to them. And I kind of get to go along for the ride, and it's actually really cool.
And as someone who you manage, I must say that I really do love how the community is so important to you, and how you always say at the end of the day, we're here to enable the developers building solutions on the Google Workspace platform. That is our job to help them with that. And I do have to say that you know almost everything. I mean, there is almost nothing that I ask you, what do you think? No, really, I have the feeling you know everything. But you did also mention you've been at Google for a long, long time. So over the years, you've built up a lot of know-how. Run us past a couple of the roles you had, a couple of the things you maybe worked on.
It's been a long time. Probably, I think the longest I've been in any one job, but it really feels like it's been a lot of different jobs and a lot of different roles over that time. When I joined, DevRel was a relatively new discipline, particularly at Google. I think there were about 20 people in all of Google at the time that were in that role. And, so it was kind of a wild west of doing things. It felt very startup-y. And back then, Workspace didn't even exist. So I was doing a lot of stuff with things that don't even exist anymore, with, a secure data connector. Then we got into, so some of the stuff around Gmail and Docs and so on. But then things really started to settle in with Workspace, with the Drive APIs, the Google Apps Marketplace, and those go back 10 years now. And over the years, a lot of different Workspace APIs, Sheets, Slides, Docs, AppScript, doing a lot of stuff with Meet these days, and different roles too. So I've been an engineer, been an advocate, working with partners. I've done some product management, some tech writing, and everything, and even things that were not Workspace. I did a little bit of Android TV, or now Google TV, and Chromecast, just really all over the place. And it's actually kind of one of the things that I think, why I'm still here is there's always new opportunities, and there's always new APIs and new challenges and new things to do that, after 15 years, it doesn't really feel that long.
And speaking of new APIs, you did mention that you were involved or looking into Meet a bit more lately. We did release the new Meet API, so it's
Mhm.
generally available now. Can you give us a little bit into or a little bit of insight into what you do when we launch a new API? Now, specifically in Meet, what was your role in that?
Well, one of the phrases that we use to describe part of developer relations is this notion of developer zero. All right, we are very often the first or one of the first developers to pick up new APIs and provide feedback. So even before the API was available to partners and developers, a lot of that was engaging with the engineering team and product management on API designs, just providing feedback and context from our experience working with developers. It's not that much of a secret that the way Google builds software is not necessarily the way the rest of the world builds software. And so having that perspective of sort of, what the external community is doing and trending with is really important, I think, for influencing products early on. But then a lot of that was just playing, building things, hitting, kind of not, I wouldn't call it QA, but just playing around and learning the APIs and trying to understand what does somebody outside of Google need to know. And then from there, it's working with our tech writers. Ken is our amazing tech writer, did a lot of the documentation for that. We built some tutorials that walk through common use cases. And a lot of it has been working with some of our launch partners. There's half a dozen or so partners that we've been working with early on, and they've been incorporating the Meet API into their products. And so a lot of that is just listening to the challenges that they're facing and working with them and the product teams to continually improve the API and make sure that they can build really great solutions, and the next generation of developers who are going to build on the platform can build even more.
And as I said, it's always enabling the developers, making sure that the product fits their needs. And then the rest of the team also is involved. You mentioned code samples, IMI case, videos. So we then all start building on that work that, you and the software developers kind of like laid the foundation to. So very cool teamwork on that. Now, I want to confront you with two separate use cases, and I want
Sure.
your opinion on it. So let's start out. Let's say you want to create a Google Workspace add-on for an organization to use internally, which automatically assigns colors to calendar events based on rules. What technology would you use and why?
That's an easy one because I actually built such an add-on.
That's where I have the idea from.
No, I actually used AppScript. For working with workspace data, whichever API, AppScript is just a really natural fit for it. And there's also some built-in support for things like calendar events, right? So if the calendar changes, AppScript has built-in support for triggering functions on that. So it just made it very simple to build an add-on that anytime there was a new event or an event was updated, I could look at it, apply a rule, change the color, and so on, and it just runs in the background. I haven't open sourced this yet. It's on my to-do list, but there are a couple of people at Google using this, and it actually works pretty well. But the way I approach AppScript is a little bit different. I actually write in TypeScript and do most of my development offline, and something we talk about later about kind of how all that works. But yeah, for that one, it's not the only way to do it, AppScript, but for me, it was such a natural fit for that use case that used it, and it worked well. And would I change it? No, not really.
Second use case. Let's say you want to create a Google Workspace add-on that leverages Vertex AI to assist you when crunching data in Google Sheets. This add-on is to be made publicly available through the Google Workspace Marketplace. Again, what technology would you use and why?
That is a little bit of a tougher one. If I'm taking the hat of third-party developer, I'm building something for the public. I have a lot more concerns about keeping that service running than if it was just something for my team or just people in my own org. My natural inclination would be something more like Node.js, like Node.js and Cloud Run, something like that, just because it's very well suited for these sort of like integration problems, right? Where I'm just building. I want to connect Workspace with some other system. For add-ons, we have the ability to call it to any language, any platform. And I just happen to like Node.js. For me, it's a very productive platform to work on. Python, also really great for that, even Java or Kotlin, whatever. But again, personally, Node.js. Where it gets complicated is, unfortunately, it's sort of complicated because of just legacy reasons. That Sheets in particular. Let's say I want that Vertex function to be called as a custom function in Sheets. Well, that unfortunately is locked behind AppScript and the editor add-ons framework. So that's not something I could actually build in Node.js, which, it's unfortunate. So depending on the feature set, I would prefer Node, but I might have to go back to something like AppScript or a hybrid of the two where there's a little bit of an AppScript shim that then calls into some other system that I have a little bit more control over. But yeah, that's a tough one. I wish it was a lot easier. I wish we could do custom functions in any language. We're not there yet. So.
You just spoke about that being a tough one. Tell me about the most challenging solution that you've ever built on the Google Workspace platform.
Part of DevRel is the things that we build are largely for education and illustration and to learn from. Complexity, or at least unnecessary complexity, is something that we really try to shy away from. If I said wow, what's the most complicated thing I built? Really not much, because I don't want to build complicated things these days, right? I want to build things that are simple and instructive and informative. That said, there's two things that come to mind. One is sort of platform adjacent, which is the card builder tool that we've had for add-ons and chat apps. In the original version, I built along with one of our UX designers, and that was really fun. It's just a client-side web app. It's built with Next.js and React. It does some really interesting things underneath the covers in terms of how it uses JSON schema and JSON patch to sort of keep models in sync, and you can have different views of the same data and real-time updates and everything. Really fun to build. Some interesting challenges underneath the covers for how all that works. But it was just a really fun problem and motivated just by a personal need that trying to build add-on demos and things like that, I was just frustrated that there wasn't a quick way to sort of see what I was building. And so we should have a tool that lets you do this. And so we built it. There's a new version coming out that the eng team that builds add-ons and the card framework. So they're actually building a whole new version of this, which is just great. But yeah, that was kind of the most complicated thing that I built recently, personally built. Kind of the flip side to all of that is, I have worked with partners who have built amazing things, particularly early on, kind of the early days of Workspace, when it was G Suite or Apps for Business. Worked with a lot of partners in the security and compliance space, and where they're trying to do as close to real-time monitoring of what data users are accessing or they're sharing with people and so on and what they can see. There are some partners at the time that were doing just amazing things, just trying to operate at they're operating at the scale of an entire organization's corpus. And so the amount of data they were processing, the amount of traffic they were sending to the APIs and the optimizations that we had to work through in order to sort of balance their need to react to data and sharing in as close to real time as possible, but while preserving the health of the APIs. There were some really interesting challenges. But again, not something I built, but just being able to kind of go along for the ride and coach them through a lot of these challenges was really interesting, and probably the one that sticks out the most. But yeah, honestly, I don't build a lot of complex things these days.
Now, while AppScript V8 runtime uses E6 syntax, models are not supported. But there is a way to use E6 models if you set up a development environment and pipeline for AppScript. I believe you have something like that in place. You want to talk a bit about it?
Kind of hinted at this earlier that the way I approach AppScript is a little bit different. I mean, if I'm doing something quick, just playing around, I'll hop into the IDE and just do things there. But if I'm building anything that is more than just a throwaway, I have a traditional engineering background, and I'm used to, using tools like GitHub and, getting different source code, repositories and different IDEs that I can configure a little bit more and I'm comfortable on the command line. So, for me, I approach AppScript as a deployment target. It's just a runtime for me. I make the developer experience in the IDE something that I have a little bit more control over. What I sort of settled on for my own personal pipeline is it's a combination of TypeScript and Rollup. And Rollup is a tool that basically bundles JavaScript and flattens it out into kind of one module, which is perfect for AppScript. So AppScript doesn't really support the notion of modules. You can have multiple files, but it's all one global namespace. And so what I do is, I'll write my code locally. I can use imports and exports and organize my code in a way that makes sense. And I can even, use NPM modules too, which is great because it opens up this entire ecosystem of code that doesn't really exist in AppScript. I mean, obviously there's restrictions, like can't use things that are browser specific or Node.js specific or so on. But if it's just vanilla JavaScript, like it generally will work fine in AppScript. So I just, I write my code locally, usually in Visual Studio.code or something like that. And then I use Rollup to basically take all those modules and flatten them down into one file that I can just push up to AppScript using Clasp. And that is a command line tool that was written by a former teammate many years ago. It's open source on GitHub, but it just allows you to sync code between AppScript and your local environment. It actually works really great in things like GitHub Actions. So yeah, there's some cases where I can push code to the main branch, it compiles down, gets pushed to AppScript, new deployment, thing is updated automatically. It makes life really easy. And you can even do some stuff with having watch mode. So I actually have it set up where if I'm typing, it'll recompile and push the code every couple of seconds. And so that delay between which we're kind of used to this in the AppScript IDE, right? We can make a change, run the code, see it works. I can get that same, or at least close to that same experience staying in my local environment. And also has some nice things. I can use like unit test frameworks like Jest, things that don't really work well in AppScript. So yeah, it works really well. I have a GitHub repo. We can maybe put the link in the video description. I sort of like a starter project that I use, and that's kind of has a lot of this stuff in there. Certainly, people are more than welcome to try it out and see if that fits their style. But I've seen a lot of people with different variations of this, and it's just very personal, very much depending on your specific needs and the technologies that you're most comfortable using.
If we get 10 people to write local AppScript in the comments section, we'll make a follow-up video with screen recordings, okay? We'll show him your development environment.
I would love to, yeah. If people are interested in that, I would be happy to kind of walk through how it works and how all the different plugins and everything come together to get the code just right for AppScript.
Okay, that's a deal. Viewers, you know what to do. Now, on to another topic that also can be challenging, that of OAuth. Yeah. Now, what's your advice on how to go about OAuth when building a solution on the Google Workspace platform?
To be honest, I've been in identity longer than I've been at Google. It's been 20-something years of identity-related development and authorization. I've worked on predecessors to OAuth with SAML and things like that. I've become a little desensitized to the challenges that people face, but it is real. I'm a little envious of our colleagues on the cloud side, for example, on GCP, where most of the time it's a service account, right? And it's like you have a key, the libraries it just works by default, right? And you don't have to really think about things like user credentials and managing, all this stuff. Whereas OAuth is it's just harder, right? You're dealing with users, that's a complexity right there. The way you implement OAuth is very much dependent on the type of the application you're building and the platform and the architecture. So OAuth for a client-side web app is different than it is for a server-side where you need offline access, and it's different on iOS and it's different on Android. The fact that you have these multipliers, right, it ties into your user experience and so on, right? There's just more considerations that go into it. That said, at the end of the day, the code for doing OAuth 2 is not that bad. The standards are way more mature. It's way easier than the original OAuth spec. And you're not obligated to use our libraries, right? It's standard, we're compliant. So any OAuth library that you're already using in your application should work fine. And you just have to change which endpoints and understand the scopes. I mean, kind of at the end of the day, the advice is very brief, I think, and very generic, which is really just understand the use case that you're trying to build, right? Pick whatever the simplest approach is that fits that, because you can get very complicated, unnecessarily so. Ask for the least amount of permission that your app actually needs. sometimes is hard to do, but that's general good advice, right? Never ask for more permission than absolutely required. And then really just plan for some of the process overhead. A lot of the sticking points we see these days is not so much on implementing OAuth itself, but just navigating the process to get your app approved by our trust and safety team. It's not always a difficult process, but there's, it is something that if you're not expecting the timelines or the requirements that they're setting or some of the feedback, right? Like, yeah, it could catch you off guard. But I think if you kind of go into it, just aware of the process, great documentation on sort of like what they expect, but just read through that ahead of time, just so that you're prepared to navigate that process. And a lot of times it goes great. Sometimes there's hiccups in the process, and we help people work through those. But it's a challenge, right? I mean, I wish it were easier, but we're getting there. But yeah, we have a way to go.
And one thing I always tell developers when they reach out to me when it comes to the review process is schedule enough time for it. I think the worst that can happen is that you want to launch right away, and then it's just going to be, a back and forth. It's going to take longer than what you expected. So schedule enough time. There's really good guides, tips and tricks, best practices that we share. So definitely have a look at that. You know what? I'll also link a video to that topic right now in the top right corner.
Yeah. I think be prepared is sort of the number one thing. Is if you go in with eyes wide open, it's really not that bad. Be prepared.
We focused until now on the topic of what our DevRel team does, what you specifically do to enable developers. But one part of our job is also taking the feedback from the developers back to the respective teams. Now, what is the best way for developers to share their feedback on our API, on our services that are part of the Workspace platform?
We have a support page which has a link to the issue tracker. That's probably the number one form of feedback. Is if you see a bug or you have a feature request, is file an issue. Can't guarantee that we're going to obviously respond to everything and prioritize everything, but we do actually look at that. That's a couple of folks on our team. We go through all that feedback, and anything that is a legitimate bug or feature request, we do forward on to the product teams, and they are also looking at those as well. Again, no promises that, we're going to act on every bit of feedback that we get, but there are a lot of people who are, that's what we do, is we try to make the platform better and listen as well as we can to the feedback and respond to as much as we can. There's also a few other channels for documentation. Every page has a feedback link where if you see a doc bug or you think something could be clarified, that goes to our tech writers. Outside that, Stack Overflow is a great place. If you have a question, right? Maybe not feedback necessarily, we just kind of want to get other people's opinions. Stack Overflow is awesome. There's a thriving AppScript community on Reddit. And, honestly, if you could track me down on, ping me on LinkedIn or Twitter or I guess X now. I engage with people just on, any channel where they're at, right? And I'm, happy we have a Discord server for Google developers as well. A few of us are there. Anywhere you can find us, right? If you're going to be in Las Vegas at Next, come stop by the Cloud Innovators, and a bunch of us are going to be there, ready to listen and talk and hear what you have to say. So we're here, we're listening. So yeah, just reach out.
And another great way to connect with our team and also share feedback and ideas and also get our opinions on what you're building is or has been in the past Google Workspace Developer Summits that we've ran in the last 2 years. Steve, can the community expect anything this year concerning Developer Summit?
Nothing to announce right now. It is something we're looking about and thinking about, but we don't have hard plans yet. But we may have something to announce at Next. So again, if you're going to be in Las Vegas, April 9th through 11th, come see us in Innovators Hive, and we will be happy to share whatever information we can. And for everyone else, I would say, yeah, stay tuned here, stay tuned on our blogs, and as soon as we have something we can share with the rest of you, you will know.
Very cool. So thank you so much for your time, Steve, and also for sharing your experience and your insights with our viewers. And looking forward to having you on the next Developer Spotlight episode, maybe next year or so, maybe after next. We'll see when. So thank you
Um,
so much.
oh, thank you for having me, and yeah, happy to be here. And I look forward to hearing from everyone else and hear what they're interested in learning about, or yeah, what feedback they have on our APIs.
Welcome to the Developer Spotlight Show. And today we have Steve Bazyl in the spotlight. No, I got to do it again. Spotlight.
It's all good.
Okay, then we go again.